I tried everything I could to stop the madness before it got out of hand. My only weapon against this insanity was my voice. But after Hitler came to power, he quickly stifled such voices by intimidation and murder.
Friedrich Kellner kept a diary exposing the lies of a brutal regime. It was an act of great courage and defiance in the face of intolerance and terror. But Friedrich Kellner was determined to stop the spread of madness in the present and for the future.
I decided that if I could not fight them in the present, then I would fight them in the future. If I could not stop their propaganda, I could at least reveal their lies so future generations would have a better chance against their own Nazis.
I'm about to enter Laubach in just a few minutes, and there is a museum there that has an exhibit about my grandfather and the diary. So I'm here on the one hand to celebrate this great triumph, this great honor for my grandparents, and also to create a biography, I hope, that will truly bring them to life, show them for what they were, the wonderful people that they were, the very brave people they were.
Scott Kellner was abandoned in an orphanage in New Haven, Connecticut, when he was only 4 years old. He grew up without a sense of family and familial love until he went to Germany and discovered the grandparents he never knew, Pauline and Friedrich Kellner. Now, 35 years after his grandparents' death, Scott is returning to Germany to tell their story and the story of his grandfather's courageous diary.
My grandfather was a highly cultured man, a musician, an artist, a writer. He was also a poet. He was so because there was such a wonderful tradition in Germany of artists and poets and musicians. I mean, so much of our classical music comes from Germany or Austria, Mozart, Beethoven.
Friedrich Kellner met and married Pauline Preuss in 1913, just before entering the German army during the First World War. He believed in fighting for a just cause, but none of those reasons seemed valid for this war. That bothered him greatly, because his father had instilled in Friedrich a love of law and justice. Their only child, Fred, was born during one of the most turbulent times in German history. World War I shattered more than the families of the dead and wounded. Goods had become scarce, and food more difficult to buy. The specter of starvation played into the hands of political demagogues who encouraged anarchy in the streets. During this time, Friedrich, a justice inspector for the German government in Mainz, became an active member of the Social Democratic Party.
So my grandfather wanted to join the party that was closely tied to the grassroots, to the people, that would help them the most, and that was the Social Democratic Party.
In 1923, a small group calling itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, under the leadership of an unabashed fascist named Hitler, called for the establishment of a dictatorship. Many in Germany were sympathetic, but not Friedrich Kellner.
From the very beginning, Hitler appeared to be a peddler and a fanatical rabble-rouser. When I saw whom Hitler surrounded himself with, that clique of ex-military men, I could see what was to come. War.
Friedrich Kellner understood, as a patriot, what consequences all this will have on German society, on Germany as his beloved country. He knew exactly that we will never lose this scarf in our history.
When Hitler published his book Mein Kampf, it was time to begin the most stringent battle against the theories proposed in that book.
Hitler spelt out his blueprint for the future. Democracy, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and all opposition groups eradicated. Aryans would be the master race, Germany the master nation.
When Mein Kampf was published, it actually was not popular at all in Germany. It sold less than 10,000 copies. And that's unfortunate because if it had sold more, perhaps more people would have read it and realized that this man was talking nonsense and that it was very dangerous. My grandfather had read that book, and he saw very clearly what was going to transpire should Hitler get elected.
To trample democracy with one's feet and to give power to a single man over almost 80 million people is so terrible that one can very probably tremble over the things which will now come.
My grandfather went everywhere in Mainz. Wherever there was a crowd gathered, his intent was to warn the people against the Nazis and what was going to happen. And even though he had to fight sometimes with his fists, he was physically brave as well as spiritually and morally brave. He decided that it was something he had to do.
I would hold Hitler's book Mein Kampf above my head and cry out, "Gutenberg, your press has been violated by this evil book." That would always stir things up. The stormtroopers would attack, and we'd have to fight our way home.
Friedrich's warnings could have led to his death. Hitler's thugs were dominating the streets and viciously attacking anyone opposing their party. The Nazi doctrine, intolerable to Friedrich and Pauline, had followed them into the sanctity of their own home. Their only child, Fred, became mesmerized by the Nazi youth movement.
Probably the single most sense of tragedy, sorrow, and failure all rolled up into one happened around 1930. My father, their only child, came home. He was 14 years old at the time, and he was whistling the Horst Wessel song. And it's a song about the Nazis taking over Germany. And there was my grandfather, the political activist for the SPD, having been brutalized by the Nazis because he was trying to keep them from coming to power. And his own son apparently had gotten caught up in an ideology that swept across Germany like an epidemic.
Es fängt erst wieder an, dann im Gymnasium. Da wurde ich 1935 aufgenommen und da fiel uns das auf, dass das alles sehr, sehr stark politisiert war. Wir wurden übernommen mit 10 Jahren, mussten wir ins Jungvolk, also in die JJ, in diese Kinderorganisation praktisch, und haben gemerkt, wie weit die Partei, also die NSDAP und die Nazi-Partei, überhaupt in die Schule reinregiert hat.
Desperate to get Fred away from the influence of the Nazis, they sent their only child to America. It would be 11 years before they would see each other again. Time enough for Hitler and his willing countrymen to conquer Europe and murder millions of people.
They knew that their son had changed a great deal since he started becoming interested in Hitler's philosophy. So they decided that it might be best for him to go to America.
Within a few years of coming to America, Fred Kellner met Frieda Schulman.
He was not quite 21, and she was still 18 when they met in 1937. And just a few months later, they decided to get married. My mother was Jewish, and my father was evangelical Lutheran. They didn't think that that was going to be a problem. They didn't think marriage would be a problem, but unfortunately they were wrong.
New Haven, Connecticut, 1946. Fred Kellner, adrift and unable to cope in his new country, despaired even more when he and his wife had 3 children within 4 years, the youngest named Robert Scott Kellner. Fred abandoned his family months after Scott was born and returned to Germany. This is where Scott's story begins.
A joyful event. Today, we received a letter through the German Red Cross from our daughter-in-law, Friedrich Kellner, from Connecticut. She reports that all goes well, and a 3rd child is born, who is now 14 months old.
It began with my father. When I was 10 months old, he and my mother separated, and they did get back together on and off for the next few years. By the time I was almost 3, he left for good. When I was 4 years old, my mother felt the urge to join the World of Mirth Carnival. She wanted to be a dancer. They were called hoochie coochie dancers. I guess we call them belly dancers. She had some idea perhaps of fame and fortune. And in order to do something like that, she had to be free of the burden of 3 children.
Scott and his siblings were taken to a Jewish home for children in Connecticut, accompanied by his mother and his mother's father. Only 4 years old, Scott had no idea why he was there and what was going to happen to him.
I had no idea where we were going. I mean, they didn't say, here, we're going to take you to this home and leave you there or anything like that. They didn't say anything, you know, we just went there. And when we arrived, I can remember it was a rather big, imposing red brick building, and I had no idea what we were going to do there. And for a while we were on the swings in the backyard, I guess, while she was talking with the administrator. And that was kind of pleasant to be on the swings. And I didn't quite understand or really believe that my mother was going to leave us there. Well, it's kind of interesting. I have the set of photos that they took, more than a dozen and a half, 16 or 17 photos. On the day that they took us there, my mother was all dressed up. She had a fancy hat on. And it was almost as if my mother just wanted to pose for photographs. And at the same time, one child after another would stand by her. She'd have our arm around us as if there was some kind of record being made that, here's a good mother, and just by circumstance, she's going to put us in this home. For a while, we were in the administration offices as well, and my mother came out, and everything happened rather quickly. I'm just thirsty. She didn't want to linger or say goodbye or anything. She just wanted to get out of there. She said, well, I'm going to leave and this man will take care of you. And she was gone. I never got the feeling she was sorry to leave us there. She was quite pleased to be free of the responsibility of us. She had her own dreams in front of her, and she was going to pursue them.
Scott was frightened and confused, left with strangers in an almost Dickensian setting.
And so it was scary, and I hated the fact that she was leaving, especially in the way she did. But again, to some extent, I was used to her, leaving me alone. So I kept thinking that it was a temporary thing, that within hours, perhaps, she would be back. One of the things that was done when we first arrived was at the head of the home. He took us for a tour to see where the different rooms were, and it was quite a big place, and it's very scary, I guess, for somebody so small to be wandering around these halls. And the next thing I knew, I was being yanked up off the floor by this fat guy stuck on a table, and he's probing in my mouth and looking in my ears, to see if I'm healthy. I started to cry, and they started yelling because I was crying. Where's my mother? What's going on here? What are you doing? Who are you? That kind of thing. I think that was the only time I remember my sister trying to protect me. She screamed out, "Leave him alone." And I remember she said, "He's only a 4-year-old boy." That's when I realized I was here to stay.
Ihr seid heute hier in dieser Muschel nur, wir werden vergehen, aber in euch wird Deutschland weiterleben. Und wenn von uns
Friedrich's warnings were in vain. By 1933, Hitler was appointed the Chancellor of Germany. All that Friedrich predicted became a frightening reality.
You, people of Germany, gave yourselves up in 1933. That is your wicked sin. Accuse yourself. Indict yourself, Germany. Cry over your own stupidity, submissiveness, fear, and cowardice.
In der Öffentlichkeit hieß es, die werden umerzogen. Das heißt, man überzeugt sie, dass die Parteien, der sie angehört haben, nicht in Ordnung ist, und sie müssen sich jetzt hinwenden zu der neuen Bewegung, hieß es ja dann. Es waren also Jugendorganisationen wurden verboten, die Pfadfinder waren verboten. Es wurde also alles gleichgeschaltet.
Hitler laid out in his book, Mein Kampf, his disdain for the general public. In spite of that, the masses go to him and howl, "Heil Hitler," just like the dumb calf electing its own butcher.
Friedrich knew his open defiance was becoming more dangerous. Yet he could not stand witness and acquiesce to this terror. So in a secret journal, he recorded the events unfolding in front of him, knowing that any opposition to the Nazi regime carried a sentence of certain death.
I decided that if I could not fight them in the present, then I would fight them in the future. If I could not stop their propaganda, I could at least reveal their lies, so future generations would have a better chance against their own Nazis. This would be mein Widerstand, my rejection of terror, my opposition.
What was so interesting to me was that my grandmother, who knew he was writing the diary and encouraged him to write the diary, also knew it was at great risk to their lives.
For several years, the leaders of the Nazi women's organizations presented to my wife application forms for admission into their groups. Despite their repeated efforts, my wife never became a member of the Nazi Party. I suggest that in all of Germany, few wives of officials are to be found who applied the same courage. Definitely courage.
Friedrich was warned to leave Mainz or face prosecution. To avoid endangering his wife, Friedrich moved north to a village known as Laubach.
And good thing he did, because shortly after Hitler came into power, one of the first edicts was to ban the Social Democratic Party and to put into jail and into concentration camps and to kill many of the leaders and many of the political activists. Sad thing is, though, he quickly discovered that there wasn't too much difference between the city and the country.
New Haven, Connecticut. Growing up in the Jewish home for children, Scott Kellner wondered where the parents he could barely remember were. Yet 4-year-old Scott found a way to look beyond the confines of the orphanage.
When I was in the home for children, there was a place that I particularly liked to go when I was sad or lonely or trying to escape an impending punishment. The home was surrounded by a fence, and at the very back of the backyard was that special place where I would go. I liked looking through the wire mesh out onto Dixwell Avenue, and it made me realize that there was this other world, this normal world outside the confines of the boundaries of the home. I realized after a while that no one was going to come and rescue me from that place, and that if I was ever going to get onto Dixwell Avenue to get into that natural world that I saw, that other world beyond that fence, I was going to have to climb by myself that fence and do my best to make my way in that world.
After 1 year of being abandoned in the orphanage, there was the rare occasion of a visitor to see the Kellner children.
One day we were told that our father was there. I think I was around 5 years old. It was about a year or so after we had been put in the home. And my sister remembers it quite well. What I recall of the visit primarily is just the fact that there was this stranger there, this man there, and somehow the lighting was such that he seemed dark, so perhaps the lighting was behind him or something.
Scott's father promised his children that he would bring the family back together.
He was sitting on my bed and talking to us, or perhaps on one of our beds, and talking to us. He said that he had come from Germany and that he was going to get back together with our mother and that we would all go back to Germany. And my sister, you know, she was 8 years old at that time, but old enough and pretty impressed by this, was delighted, you know, because she hated it in that place, as you can imagine. And a few days later, we found out that he was never coming back. So instead, we remained there in that home for another 6 years after that visit. And my sister truly believed that he was going to take us to Germany. So for all those years, she waited for him.
Friedrich found that even the small village of Laubach was a hotbed of Nazis. There, Friedrich was responsible for the administration of the courthouse, second in command to the presiding judge, Herr Schmidt. As chief administrators, Friedrich and the judge were given the 2 apartments within the courthouse to live in.
The judge, who lived in the courthouse in a separate apartment, was constantly after him to join the party.
I found even the judges were rushing to join the Nazi party, singing Hitler's praises, and they insisted I joined the party with them. I adamantly refused and even told them why. I do not join with tyrants. I am close to being in serious trouble for my views, but I had dedicated my life to the law, and I could not join those who so wholeheartedly admired the chief of the lawbreakers.
As murderous as the Nazis were, they were smart enough to realize that they couldn't go around killing their own mid-level officials, which is what my grandfather was. They had been after him from the very beginning to join the Nazi party, and they warned him that he had better do that And if nothing else, he had better keep his mouth shut and never say anything bad again about the Nazis.
This Adolf Hitler is the most crafty criminal of all time. He is Satan and the devil in one person. He is the bloodiest tyrant, filled with cruelty and unremitting hardness.
Über der jüdischen Parole, Proletarier aller Länder, vereinigt euch, wird eine höhere Erkenntnis ziehen, nämlich schaffende Angehörige aller Nationen, erkennt euren gemeinsamen Feind.
(1935) Nuremberg, Germany. The Nazis passed laws discriminating against Jews. Jews were stripped of their citizenship. They now faced rampant discrimination and ever-increasing terror. Friedrich Kellner could foresee what would happen to the Jewish citizens of Germany. He knew the evil of the Nazi regime and what they would ultimately do. It was on this night that the world first understood the savage intention of Hitler. Kristallnacht turned out to be a grim foreshadowing of what was to happen to the rest of Europe's Jews. Under a direct order of the Nazi leaders, throughout Germany and Austria, mobs destroyed Jewish-owned stores and synagogues. By the end of this rampage, hundreds of Jews were murdered and thousands more rounded up and sent to concentration camps.
They raced through Laubach. They went from one Jewish house to the other. My grandparents' apartment overlooked the street, and as they saw what was occurring, they shouted from the windows to the young men, a lot of them were young men, rushing by and trying to find out what was causing this craziness among them and trying to get them to come to their senses and to stop them.
Und dann hat das hat ja gerumst, das war ja so fürchterlich, gell. Die haben die schöne Scheibe, da waren in der Synagoge so bunte Glasscheibe, gell. Die flogen bei uns rum neben, wir hatten so ein kleines Hühnerpferch vor dem Haus, da flogen die Scherben drin rum. So ist das Zeug bis zu uns rüber geflogen, gell. Und dann ist mir in Erinnerung, dann stellte sich einer hin und wollte eine Zigarette anzünden. Da habe ich geschrien und gebrüllt. Ich habe gedacht, jetzt tun sie das in die Luft sprengen und ich fliege mitten in die Luft hier, gell. Ich war 10 Jahre damals, gell, und da musste man das so mit angucken, gell, und das Unheimliche, den Krach, den die gemacht haben, die haben ja alles im Fenster rausgeworfen, gell.
Meine Mutter hat gesagt, also hör zu, was der Papa gesagt hat, ihr bleibt jetzt hier und bewegt euch nicht weg. Und wir waren natürlich neugierig und da sind wir haben uns dann bis nach Haus, dann wie es dunkel wurde, wie es richtig dunkel war. Und später haben sie das ganze Inventar mit den Torerollen auf den jüdischen Leichenwagen geladen und haben das auf den Festplatz gefahren und haben es dort verbrannt.
Went upstairs to the judge's apartment. There was a flight of steps leading between their apartment and the judge's apartment. And they both went up there to not just ask the judge to stop this, to bring a halt to it, but to tell the judge that it was his responsibility to bring it to a halt. And of course, nothing was done.
This unfeeling, sadistic, and cunning treatment against the Jews that has lasted now several years with its final goal of eradication is the biggest stain on the honor of Germany. They will never be able to erase these crimes.
Scott had dreams of an ordinary American family, an experience that he would never know as a child.
And When I got older, I was finally allowed to leave the home's premises to go out on Halloween. And this might be comical in a way, but walking around on Halloween, you know, with a little mask on and knocking on doors, asking for candy, it wasn't the candy that I looked for when the doors opened. No, it's all right. I'm not quite sure if I can ever explain the feeling I got. House after house after house, here were these people, what it was they did that my mother didn't do, my father didn't do, that gave them that wonderful house where they can open the door and give treats to little kids they never met. It was actually seeing people coming to the door, opening the door, and seeing behind them their living rooms. I was able to, in some way, find a motivation to reach for that kind of life, that kind of family on Halloween. You know, it's quite interesting.
War. Precisely at dawn on September 1st, without warning, the German Wehrmacht rolled over the Polish border.
September 1st, 1939. Friedrich's prediction about Hitler waging war became reality as Germany brutally bombed and conquered Poland.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note, stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock...
Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland. The German officers did not object. The German troops did not rebel. The German people did not protest. And now they and the entire world will pay for their indifferences to tyranny and terrorism.
Friedrich continued to be harassed for refusing to join the Nazi Party. On Friday morning, March 22, 1940, the Sergeant-at-Arms came to Friedrich's office demanding that he appear immediately before the regional director of the Nazi Party. Convinced that their lives were in danger, Pauline found the diaries and destroyed them. Many of Friedrich's records of opposition were left in ashes.
They had a series of specific complaints to make against him, and they kept trying to get him to speak out against Hitler. They kept prodding him in a way to see what exactly were his specific views about Adolf Hitler. My grandfather knew what they were trying to do. They were trying to get him to incriminate himself. He was told to keep his mouth shut, and if he continued to be a bad influence on the people of Laubach, they would put him in a concentration camp. And of course, that would mean death.
As proof of his patriotism, Friedrich slowly and deliberately rolled up his trouser leg to show them the wounds he suffered during the First World War.
After this tribunal, my grandfather walked back to the apartment, and he, of course, could see instantly that somebody had rifled through the desk where he kept the diary, and that drawer was lying on the floor, and it was empty. And his heart sank, and my grandmother could see what he was thinking, and she said, "No, I was able to save your papers from them. They didn't get them. I burned some of them, and I put some in my shirt." And he turned around and he went upstairs to his study, and he took out another notebook and began to rewrite what had been destroyed.
I knew that if Hitler were to win the war, he would rewrite history to cover up his murders. If he lost, all those who let themselves be fooled by this devil and served as his accomplices would find it in their own best interests to minimize Nazi crimes or pretend they never happened. My diary would be the truth, so that my grandchildren and other children in the world would have a torch and a weapon to light their way through the darkness.
When Scott's mother came to visit, Scott learned that his dreams of his family reuniting were doomed. Without work and despondent, having severed his ties with family and country, Scott's father had killed himself.
And a letter came, and my mother very bluntly said that our father was dead, that Nazi bastard is dead. It didn't really have much effect on me. I mean, I had no feeling for my father, but my sister did. She was older, you know, and so she had this memory of him, perhaps some memories of him even before, you know, he left. I'm not sure. And so she was very upset by it, and she even fainted. And I remember the lack of sympathy for her. My mother was very angry at her. What do you care? What are you crying for? What did he ever do for you? He abandoned you. Shut up. And of course, there was this enormous irony that, I mean, she too had abandoned us as well. My sister was very upset about our father's death, even more upset than I was, because she remembered him so much better than I did. And she kept repeating how he had promised to take us out of the home and bring us to Germany. And in fact, she had for many years believed that and kept waiting for our father to come back to the home to take us to Germany. He promised, she said. And I told her, I said, I'll take you to Germany. We can still do that.
Earlier today, German troops crossed over the Russian border. A true, actual world war.
Hitler is a monster of wickedness, insatiable in his lust for blood and plunder. So now this bloodthirsty gutter snipe must launch his mechanized armies upon new fields of slaughter, pillage and devastation.
Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France have all fallen victim to our attacks. Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania have lost their independence.
As the Allies moved closer to conquering Germany, leaflets were dropped in open fields. The leaflets asked the German people to assist the Allies in ending the war. This gave Friedrich a further opportunity for active resistance. After each air raid, Friedrich gathered the leaflets, risking imprisonment, to place them where they would be easier to find.
It was against the law to read the leaflets. It was against the law to keep the leaflets. And in the newspaper, there was always an article about somebody who had been found with these leaflets, just holding them, picking them up, and they were sentenced to prison. Some were sentenced to death. My grandfather would carry with him these Flugblätter, these leaflets. He would deposit them on the trains and in the train depots and on the buses, and he particularly delighted, he told me, to bring them to the offices of the most fervent Nazi members and just surreptitiously leave them on the desks or even on the floor. So even in that, he risked his life. This is the Marktplatz, the marketplace in Laubach. And there were some Jewish families that lived here. In 1942, the Gestapo brought a truck here to this corner where I'm standing. And the Strauss family and the Katzes and the Wallensteins and the other Jews of Laubach were put into the truck, taken away from Laubach, and never heard of again.
In the last few days, the Jews from this region have been removed. The families Strauss and Heinemann were taken from Laubach. I've heard from a reliable source that all the Jews were taken to Poland and murdered by the SS brigades. This cruelty is terrible. Such horror will never be able to be erased from the book of humanity. Our murderous regime has for all times besmirched the name of Germany. It is unfathomable for the decent German that no one can put an end to these Hitler bandits.
There was a soldier who was on leave, and this was in 1941. The soldier started to talk to my grandfather about what had occurred just a few weeks ago in what was then Poland, Ukraine. He said that he witnessed, this young soldier told my grandfather, that he witnessed Jews being stripped naked, lined up before a ditch, and shot in the back of their heads by the Ukrainians who were being forced by the SS and the Gestapo to do the killing.
October 28, 1941. A soldier on vacation here reported as an eyewitness terrible atrocities on the occupied parts of Poland. He had watched as naked Jewish men and women were placed in front of a long, deep ditch and shot in the back. He could hear their screams as the ditch was closed.
At age 16, Scott had quit school. The years of loneliness had taken their toll as Scott found himself without direction or future goals. Bereft of family, Scott fortuitously joined the U.S. Navy.
And it was wonderful having the knowledge that every day I get 3 meals a day and I had a place to stay. For the first 2 years, I was stationed in Virginia. And then, to my surprise, I wasn't sure if it was to my pleasure or not, I was ordered to go to Saudi Arabia. The one good thing about it, I discovered, was that I was first to stop at Frankfurt Air Force Base in Germany. I had information about my father's parents. I wanted to find out for myself what they were like. I knew what town they lived in. It was called Laubach. I was a pretty wild kid, a juvenile delinquent type of kid. And so I decided to do what I felt I had to do, wanted to do, and I went AWOL. I didn't know initially that there were 6 different Laubachs, at least, in Germany. I had no idea which one to go to. I couldn't speak a word of German. I went to 3 of them, and each time I left one, I never was certain if perhaps I just left my grandparents behind me. I knocked on several doors and got all sorts of different answers, all in German.
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European fortress. The first official news came just after 9:30, when Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, usually called SHAPE, from its...
Finally, with an ever-increasing excitement, we heard today the announcement that at the North French coast, landings were made.
...for a strong air of Western Europe.
A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe.
With the Allied landing in France and the Russian advances on the Eastern Front, Hitler's grip on world domination was quickly unraveling.
The hour of your liberation is approaching.
The biggest story in Western Europe today is the attempted assassination of Hitler. For the second time since this war began, an assassin has almost succeeded in killing the Führer and perhaps changing the course of history. It is now 7 hours since the Germans announced the bare fact that an explosive charge had injured Hitler and a number of his collaborators.
I welcome the survival of the Führer, because for tactical reasons, he must remain alive to the very bitter end. Germans in the future must have no excuses for why this war was lost, and they must never be able to say, if only Hitler had lived to the end, he would have shown us the way to victory. Hitler must remain until there is no more way out, until Providence itself would not be able to come to his side to help.
I've walked by many times and never even thought to walk inside. So now today I go inside, and my main thing was to find his apartment, but not just his apartment, but to find his study. And not just his study, but to find the window in his study that he was looking out on March 28th when the bomb dropped.
I was sitting at my desk around 3 in the afternoon when planes flew over Laubach, pursuing the German columns. Suddenly, my view is directed towards the sky, and a bomb explodes at the post office across the street. It is a trick of fate that just a few moments ago, Pauline and I were outside closing the gate. But we can hold up under everything if only we can have the certainty that the monster Hitler, with his insatiable bloodletting and plundering, will have committed soon his last shameful deed.
This is the window.
all-purpose vehicle which is taking us over the Rhine. I'm crouching with the commanding officer of the assault battalion. And in his brain gun carrier fills the Buffalo, and on the brain gun carrier pile his men, tin-hatted, and we're watching, gazing towards that far bank of the Rhine.
The Rhine has been crossed. The German army is in flight. Since yesterday evening, March 26, 1945, cars heading east are racing past our building. We could not sleep the whole night because of the noise. The best army in the world, as it has been called so often, is retreating, is fleeing back. To where?
Scott continued his search for his grandparents.
But anyway, I went to the next one, the 4th Laubach. But before I got there, the train stopped in a town called Hungen. There was a young man and a young girl sitting across from me, and we struck up a conversation.
I saw this young sailor, in a handsome young man in a handsome uniform, and in those days teenage girls were quite struck by Americans, so I was no exception, and I stared at him, I suppose. And I guess that encouraged him to come over.
They were looking at me, you know, very friendly. I was wearing an American sailor suit, and they were looking at me with interest and with some smiles.
And he told us that he was looking for his grandfather, and could we possibly help him, or did we know, you know, is this the right Laubach? Did we happen to know him? And we did.
And found out that yes, indeed, there was a Kellner family in this particular Laubach, and actually they were neighbors of this Kellner family. So this girl and her brother kind of took me under their wing, took me by bus to Laubach, to their own parents' home, and told their parents that I was there in search of my grandparents, and I was going to go to see them.
Shortly after 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there are noises on the road. In the cellar of our building are gathered those wounded in the name of Nazi propaganda. Among them, naturally, are the party members who do not have a clean conscience. They believe the approaching Allied soldiers will behave like the German soldiers did in Poland, etc. This sheepish fear makes me feel joy. We went to the courthouse entrance and saw the advance guard drive by. For the first time, we behold Americans.
Upon retiring after the war, Friedrich and Pauline built a small home in Laubach, away from their apartment in the courthouse and the memories it held.
It was a freezing day. It was October, so I was freezing, and yet at the same time, very excited about what was happening. As I was walking up the hill towards my grandparents' home, I felt this strange sensation that here was a part of my family that had done something concrete with their lives. I had grown up in a way where having a home was something totally beyond our capacities. And here, supposedly, were my grandparents with their own home and their own land. They had done well somehow. And I got this momentary feeling that, gosh, if I belonged to them, then I myself might have a chance to do well. On the other hand, though, I wasn't quite sure what to expect, because from my way of looking at it, I knew nothing about him other than he had been a justice inspector. So I assumed that he was a Nazi, and I had to prepare myself to forgive him, you know, for a myriad of crimes that I thought he might have committed. I was confronted by a dilemma. Was this a Nazi before me?
Here, over an acre of ground, lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which, except perhaps by...
In the broadcast transmissions by the Allies these past few days, we are receiving descriptions of the conditions in the German concentration camps, which can only be called bestial and unforgivable. That even a single concentration camp could exist here is a dishonor to our culture. These abuses by the arbitrary master dictator Adolf Hitler and his devoted bandits will exist forever as a glaring warning signal in the history books of mankind.
Stark naked in the dust, trying to wash themselves and to catch the lice on their bodies.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that, the German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Adolf Hitler, the most ingenious military leader of all times, the all-powerful ruler over the 1,000-year Reich, which went down after only 12 years, has disappeared from the scene. The Nazi Party has collapsed infamously. All the planning that Hitler made has come to nothing. The craziest of all political systems, the unique totalitarian state, has found its earned end.
And there in front of me was an older man and a small, petite, older woman. And obviously, these were my grandparents. I was told that my grandparents, who had been in a state of depression for some time, who had become recluses in the town, who had almost given up all hope of life, really, upon the news of the death of their son, the suicide of the son, that they were eager to see me.
Neither Scott nor his grandparents could be certain that they were indeed family. It was only when they saw the photo, the same photo Scott carried in his wallet, that they knew, at last, they had found each other.
And so if they had any question at all in their minds, certainly not in their hearts, that I knew their son and was their son's son, the photograph certainly clinched it for them. That was the first time they learned a little bit of the truth of what had happened with their only child, their son, when he went to America. They had no idea that I had been placed in a children's home in America. They had no idea that their son had really abandoned us. And here I am showing up in their lives. The problem we faced, my grandparents and I, was that I couldn't speak any German, and my grandfather had only a smattering of English. So he came up with 2 dictionaries, one for me and one for him, and we sat there trying to tell each other all about our lives, and of course it was done in the shortest way imaginable. And I thought that, you know, it was just a wonderful experience. I never really I was here altogether for 4 days. That first day was a very joyous one. My grandfather seemed to want to get to work right away with me to try to explain to me what he had done during the war. And of course, I was delighted to find out and so relieved that he had not been, you know, a verbrecher, a criminal of any sort. And to the contrary, I mean, he had written this diary that he spread out on this table before me. It took me a few minutes to figure out what it was he was laying out on this table. All these notebooks, there were 10 of them all together. And then the first one had on it, mein Widerstand. So that was the first word I learned with the diary, my opposition, my resistance. And then I knew instantly that this was some kind of diary that he had written in resistance against the Nazis. I could tell right away that my grandparents really cared about what I did. And so he kept giving me advice about what I needed to do. I needed to get to school, and not only for myself, but for him, for my grandmother, and to translate this diary so that it could be used as a weapon, perhaps, in the future. I hated to leave, but I really had little choice. As I was leaving, my grandmother said something in German, and what she was telling me was that because I had grown up in a children's home or an orphanage, that it was incumbent upon me to fulfill a responsibility to pay that back to other children in some way by finding my own orphanage, a children's home, and being kind to those children, kinder perhaps than I had received myself. I knew that when I left here that I would achieve what they wanted me to achieve. That was a very strong part of it, and also just my perception of what could be done by a person named Kellner.
As an adult, Scott worked with a world charity to support international orphanages. Responding to his grandparents' wishes, he went back to school and eventually received a PhD. He became fluent in German and translated the diaries into English. Scott has spent his entire adult life bringing attention to these historic diaries.
This is the room in the Heimat Museum where they have the exhibit about my grandfather's diary. I was very delighted to hear from them that they wanted to host this exhibit because it's only a few doors down where my grandfather actually wrote the diary. At this point in my work to bring my grandfather's diary to the attention of the public, I'm very pleased that it has brought and will bring more honor to him. It's wonderful to know that he's being honored by an exhibit in his hometown, by another exhibit soon to happen in Germany, by an exhibit in the Presidential Library, by an exhibit in Houston coming up, by an exhibit in a new museum being built in Canada, perhaps to find its permanent home there in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. It's a marvelous feeling. Es ist eine große Ehrung für mein Großvater. It's a great honor for my grandfather.
Friedrich, Pauline, and Scott Kellner survived through one of the most perilous times in history. The courage of two German grandparents and the determination of an abandoned child to find his lost family has left humanity with this lasting legacy.
I knew that if Hitler would win this war, he would rewrite history to cover up his murders. If he lost, all those fooled by this devil would pretend Nazi crimes never happened. But I was determined to confront them with my eyewitness testimony. In my notes would be the truth, and from this truth, my grandchildren and other children in the world would have a torch and a weapon to light their way through the darkness.